Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right.
So, imagine you're offered this incredible high-level advisory role for, like, a major geopolitical player.
Okay, I'm listening.
The pay is just staggering. The influence is completely unmatched, and you finally have the power to implement all these, ethical reforms you've been talking about for years.
Sounds like a dream job.
Right. But there's just one catch. The person offering you the job is essentially a warlord who's currently holding a major city hostage.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a catch.
So the question is, do you take the job? Do you believe your moral compass is, strong enough to change a corrupt system from the inside? Or do you reject it, walk away, keep your hands clean, but know that by doing nothing, the corruption is only going to spread?
Man, I mean, that is the ultimate dilemma of the engaged citizen, right?
Yeah.
And it's a question that has literally been tearing leaders apart for millennia. When you look at the political and, honestly, the corporate landscapes today, we're still completely paralyzed by this exact scenario.
We really are. And what we're looking at today in our deep dive is a text that just tackles that paralysis head on. We are digging into books 17 through 20 of the Analects.
Yep.
And for you listening, if you're already familiar with the broad strokes of Eastern philosophy, you know that the standard reading of these texts often paints them as this really rigid set of rules, like about bowing correctly and obeying your parents.
Exactly, the superficial stuff.
Right. But when you bypass that surface level interpretation and you dig into the actual historical friction of these specific books, you find this shockingly pragmatic, battle-tested manual for surviving a collapsing society.
Which is why the architectural metaphor in Book 19, Chapter 23, is just the most critical starting point for this whole analysis.
Well, I love this part.
It's so good. So the disciple Tse is essentially confronted by critics who suggest that his own philosophy is, more practical and accessible than his master's. And Tse responds by comparing his own wisdom to a wall that is shoulder high. Anyone walking past can just peer over it and see the contents of his house.
Okay, simple enough.
Right. But then he compares the master's wisdom to a wall that is several fathoms high.
See, okay, let me push back on Tse defense here for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Because on a first read, this sounds suspiciously like intellectual gatekeeping.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It sounds like he's saying, my master's ideas are so lofty and obscure that you commoners couldn't possibly understand them without a special key. And in an era where we constantly demand transparency from our thought leaders, building a towering wall around your philosophy seems, inherently elitist.
I mean, that is definitely the immediate modern reflex. We hate barriers, but if we analyze the mechanics of the metaphor, Tse isn't describing a barrier meant to keep people out.
Okay.
He's actually describing the necessary infrastructure for depth. Think about it.
Yeah.
A shoulder-high wall just encloses a simple courtyard.
Right.
It requires very little structural integrity.
Right.
But a wall that is 20 or 30 feet high is protecting an ancestral temple. It implies this vast, complex, internal ecosystem.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Tse explicitly states that if you don't find the door, you just can't see the richly dressed officers and the beauty of the temple inside. So the height of the wall isn't the point.
The door is the point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The point is that profound systems of thought require an entry point. You cannot simply glance over a wall at a complex system and claim you understand its mechanics.
That reframes it entirely for me. It's like, it's the difference between reading a Wikipedia summary of a macroeconomic theory
Right.
and actually understanding the complex mathematical models that drive it. You can't just peer over the wall at the math. You literally have to walk through the door of foundational study. Today, we're going to find that door together.
I love that. And that foundational study, the first door we really have to walk through to access the mechanics of this text, is understanding their underlying assumption about human hardware versus human software.
Oh, I like that framing.
Yeah, in Book 17, Chapter 2, the master lays down this psychological baseline. He says, by nature, men are nearly alike. By practice, they get to be wide apart.
Man. I look at that and immediately think of the modern debates around, genetic determinism versus neuroplasticity.
Oh, absolutely.
We spend just an enormous amount of cultural energy debating talent. We look at a generational athlete or a savant programmer or even just a phenomenally empathetic leader, and our default assumption is always that they possess some inherent immutable trait that the rest of us just lack.
Right. We attribute it all to nature.
Exactly. We say they were just born that way.
Because attributing success to nature lets the rest of us off the hook.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Think about it. If a brilliant leader is simply born brilliant, then our own mediocrity is just a biological tragedy rather than a failure of effort.
Right. It's not my fault. I just didn't get the genes.
Exactly. But the text systematically dismantles that excuse. By stating that our baseline nature is roughly identical, the text shifts the entire burden of greatness onto the mechanism of practice.
But if practice is the sole differentiator, that implies a terrifying amount of responsibility on our part. Because if we are getting wide apart based on our habits, we have to audit exactly what those habits are.
Yes.
And this is where the text introduces the mechanism that regulates practice, which the master identifies as the love of learning.
And we really must define learning correctly here because it's so easy to misunderstand.
How so?
Well, in the context of the late spring and autumn period, learning was not passive data consumption.
Okay.
It wasn't just memorizing scrolls in a library. It was the active, aggressive calibration of one's character against the reality of the world. It was total contextual awareness.
Which leads us directly into what I think is one of the most fascinating lists in the entire text. The 6 words and 6 becloudings in Book 17, Chapter 8.
Yes, this is a masterclass in psychology.
It really is. So the master pulls his disciple, you, aside to explain how virtuosic traits, our very best qualities, decay into toxic liabilities if they aren't regulated by this contextual calibration.
Right.
He lists 6 specific virtues and how the absence of learning triggers a psychological decay or a beclouding. Let's actually take these one by one and look at the mechanics of this decay.
That's it.
Okay, the first is the love of being benevolent without the love of learning. The beclouding here leads to a foolish simplicity.
So the mechanism at play here is toxic empathy.
Toxic empathy.
Yeah. Benevolence is the desire to reduce suffering and provide care, which is obviously good. But if you lack learning, which again means you lack an understanding of long-term consequences, systemic incentives, and human manipulation, your benevolence literally becomes a weapon used against you.
It's the manager who refuses to fire an incredibly toxic employee because they feel bad about the employee's personal life.
Spot on.
Like the manager thinks they're acting out of benevolence, they think they're being compassionate, but because they refuse to learn how that toxicity is destroying the rest of their team, their benevolence devolves into foolish simplicity. They end up enabling the very harm they thought they were preventing.
Exactly. The virtue, completely uncalibrated by reality, just becomes a vice.
Wow.
And the second beclouding is perhaps the most relevant to our current technological era. He says, the love of knowing without the love of learning, the beclouding here leads to dissipation of mind.
Wait, hold on. How can you have a love of knowing without a love of learning? Aren't those just synonyms?
Not at all. Knowing in this context is the accumulation of facts. It is raw data gathering. Learning, on the other hand, is the synthesis of that data into a coherent, actionable worldview.
Okay, let me test an analogy here.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Having a love of knowing without a love of learning is like having 75 browser tabs open simultaneously, but not having a central processing unit capable of organizing any of that data into a single executed task.
That is perfect.
You possess all the information in the world, but the mechanism of your brain is just totally paralyzed.
That is exactly the mechanical breakdown of dissipation of mind. When you consume data endlessly, reading every news article, tracking every global crisis, memorizing statistics, but you do it without a framework to apply that knowledge toward constructive action, your mind just scatters. You become perpetually anxious and entirely ineffective. The data doesn't make you wise, it just dissipates your cognitive focus.
God, that hits close to home for anyone on social media.
Doesn't it?
Okay, which brings us to the third one. And this one feels like a direct attack on modern therapy culture.
Oh, absolutely.
The love of being sincere without the love of learning, the beclouding here leads to an injurious disregard of consequences.
This is such a profound critique of our modern obsession with authenticity. We live in an era that elevates living your truth as the highest possible moral good.
Oh, for sure.
The assumption is that if a feeling is genuine, expressing it must inherently be virtuous.
But the text is arguing that uneducated authenticity is actually a destructive force. Like, if you are deeply, genuinely angry, your sincerity is real. But if you act on that sincere anger without learning, without pausing to calculate the collateral damage to your family, your career, or your community, you trigger an injurious disregard of consequences. You're essentially saying, My internal emotional state is more important than the external reality of all the people around me.
And that cascades so perfectly into the fourth beclouding, which is the love of straightforwardness without the love of learning. The beclouding here leads to rudeness.
Oh, I know this person. The I just tell it like it is coworker.
Precisely. The brutally honest friend. Straightforwardness is efficiency of communication, right?
Hey.
It is a vital virtue in any organization. But if you lack the emotional intelligence to read a room, or to understand the psychological state of the person you're speaking to, or even to gauge the appropriate timing for your feedback, you aren't being straightforward. You are just committing verbal assault.
Yes.
The learning is the shock absorber that allows the heavy machinery of straightforwardness to travel over uneven human terrain without completely breaking the axles.
That's such a great image. I want to focus on the fifth one now, because this really hits at the heart of our whole entrepreneurial mythos. The love of boldness without the love of learning. The beclouding here leads to insubordination. We culturally worship boldness. The entire Silicon Valley ethos for a decade was move fast and break things.
And we are currently witnessing the fallout of that exact beclouding.
Oh, big time.
Boldness is the willingness to take on risk and challenge the status quo, sure. But when a founder or leader dismantles regulatory frameworks or institutional norms without first learning why those structures were erected in the first place, it isn't innovation.
Right.
It's insubordination against the stability of the entire system. You see this when financial tech companies bypass traditional banking regulations purely out of boldness, only to trigger massive liquidity crises because they just didn't learn the historical mechanisms of bank runs.
It's Chesterton's fence.
Yeah.
You know, you don't tear down a fence until you understand why it was built in the first place. Boldness tears down the fence blindly. Learning studies the fence first. And finally, the sixth beclouding. The love of firmness without the love of learning. The beclouding here leads to extravagant conduct.
So firmness is resilience. It is the ability to hold your ground under immense pressure.
Yeah.
But firmness, without the continuous intake of new data, without the willingness to adjust your priors based on a shifting reality that just calcifies into stubbornness.
The sunk cost fallacy.
Yes.
Think of a CEO who is firm in their commitment to a failing product line. The market data clearly shows it's a disaster, but the CEO views changing course as a lack of firmness, a lack of grit. So they just double down, pouring millions into a completely dead project. That is the extravagant conduct. They are hemorrhaging resources simply to protect their own self-image of being a firm leader.
So really, the diagnostic question for you, the listener, is a matter of auditing your primary virtue. Look at your best trait. Identify the trait that has brought you the most success, whether it's your empathy, your honesty, your grit.
Yeah, pick the thing you're proudest of.
Right. Now look very closely at the shadow it casts. Are you actively maintaining the contextual calibration required to keep that virtue from decaying into a beclouding? Because the text makes a terrifying argument.
Yeah.
Your greatest strength, left uncalibrated, will inevitably become your fatal flaw.
That is wow. Okay, if we accept that premise that our internal software requires this constant, grueling calibration, we have to look at the environment where we are actually deploying that software. And this forces us to address that historical friction I mentioned right at the start. Because throughout books 17 and 18, we see this pristine philosophy colliding violently with a deeply corrupt geopolitical reality.
To understand the stakes of this collision, we really have to look at the power dynamics of the time. The master is operating in an era where central authority is completely crumbling. Legitimate rulers are being usurped by their own ministers, and those ministers are in turn being overthrown by their own military commanders.
Just chaos.
It is a nesting doll of rebellion and usurpation. And it's within this chaotic environment that figures like Yang Ho and PC, who are essentially warlords holding cities by force, repeatedly attempt to recruit the master to legitimize their own regimes.
And in Book 17, Chapter 7, we hit this incredible moment of tension. PC, a rebel who has violently seized a stronghold, sends an invitation to the master, and the master is actually inclined to go.
Yes.
He is seriously considering taking a position in this rebel government, and his disciple, Tzu, is just apoplectic. He confronts the master and basically says, wait, you explicitly taught us that a superior man will not associate with someone who is guilty of doing evil. PC is an illegitimate rebel. If you go to him, you are violating your own core doctrine.
Tzu is completely weaponizing the master's own teachings against him, demanding this strict ideological purity.
And frankly, Tzu seems to be entirely in the right here.
He does.
I mean, from a modern optics perspective, taking a paycheck from a violent usurper looks like a complete abandonment of your principles. It looks like you're just rationalizing a sellout. How can the master possibly defend this without looking like a massive hypocrite?
Well, he defends it by arguing for the supremacy of structural integrity over superficial contamination. The master replies, and I love this quote, "Is it not said that if a thing be really hard, it may be ground without being made thin? Is it not said that if a thing be really white, it may be steeped in a dark fluid without being made black?"
The physics of that metaphor are just fascinating. He isn't denying that Pisces administration is a dark fluid. He fully admits the environment is toxic.
Right.
But he's arguing that his own moral density, which he built through the relentless practice and learning we just talked about, is so impenetrable that he can submerge himself in that toxicity without actually absorbing it.
And then he delivers what I think is the final defining image of his entire political philosophy. He says, "Am I a bitter gourd? How can I be hung up out of the way of being eaten?"
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of the bitter gourd, because I think a lot of people might miss this. It isn't just some quaint agricultural reference. It's a devastating critique of ideological purists.
Yes. So a bitter gourd is a hollow, inedible fruit. Because it cannot provide nourishment, its only utility is purely aesthetic. Farmers would literally dry them out and hang them on the walls of their homes as decorations.
Just hanging there doing nothing.
Exactly. So the master's looking at his disciple, who is demanding that they stay away from the messiness of politics to maintain their moral purity, and he rejects the premise entirely. He is essentially saying, "I have spent my life cultivating wisdom, policy, and virtue. If I simply hang myself on the wall to keep my hands clean, refusing to engage with a starving world just because the kitchen is dirty, I am as useless as a bitter gourd."
He's arguing that utility actually requires contamination. If you want to feed the people, you have to get off the wall, get chopped up, and be consumed by the chaotic machinery of the state.
It is a radical defensive compromise. And we see this debate constantly in modern politics and corporate governance today.
All the time.
You have activists who demand absolute ideological purity, who refuse to negotiate or collaborate with anyone who doesn't perfectly align with their values. They preserve their pristine moral image, sure, but they pass no legislation, they change no policies, they remain pure, and they remain entirely ineffective.
They are bitter gourds hanging on the wall.
Precisely. The master is advocating for the dangerous, gritty work of stepping into the dark fluid to actually move the needle of justice, even if it stains your reputation.
But, and here is the pushback, the danger of that philosophy is that every corrupt politician uses that exact same logic to justify their own slide into unethical behavior. You know, I have to play the dirty game to do good in the end. At what point does the dark fluid actually just turn you black?
And that is the exact counter-argument presented in Book 18, Chapter 6 by the recluses, because there were intellectuals who looked at the exact same crumbling society, watched people try to fix it from the inside, and concluded that the dark fluid always wins.
This is the encounter with Chongsu and Qini.
Yes.
The master is traveling, and his disciple approaches these two men who are working in a field. And these are men who have completely checked out of the system. They've abandoned the cities, abandoned politics, and retreated into total agrarian isolation.
When the disciple asks him for directions, they actually recognize who he is. And Qini delivers this blistering critique of the master's philosophy of engagement. He says, "Disorder, like a swelling flood, spreads over the whole empire. And who is he that will change its state for you?" He is characterizing the corruption not as a localized problem, but as an uncontrollable natural disaster.
He's basically saying, you can't negotiate with a tsunami.
Exactly. And he goes on, "Then follow one who merely withdraws from this one and that one," meaning the master, who just bounces from warlord to warlord trying to find a foothold. Had you not better follow those who have withdrawn from the world altogether?
I have to admit, the allure of that argument is overwhelmingly powerful today.
Oh, incredible.
This is the philosophical bedrock of so many modern withdrawal movements, whether it's the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, where the goal is to hoard enough capital to permanently detach from the corporate machine, or the extreme off-the-grid survivalists, or honestly, even just the psychological withdrawal of profound cynicism.
Right.
The underlying belief is identical to the recluses. The system is a swelling flood. It is fundamentally unfixable. So the only rational response is to secure your own patch of land, plant your seeds, and let the empire drown.
It is a highly rational argument, based entirely on self-preservation. But when the disciple returns and reports this conversation to the master's response reveals the tragic core of his whole philosophy. He doesn't argue that the recluses are factually wrong about the flood. In fact, the text notes that he sighs.
He feels the weight of it.
He really does. And then he says, "It is impossible to associate with birds and beasts as if they were the same with us. If I associate not with these people, with mankind, with whom shall I associate? If right principles prevailed through the empire, there would be no use for me to change its state."
The mechanism he is pointing to here is human solidarity as an inescapable condition. You cannot opt out of the human race. You can retreat to a field, sure, but you're still a human being, not a bird or a beast. Your fate is inextricably bound to the fate of the collective.
The master is completely exposing the central paradox of the recluse's cynicism. If the world were functioning perfectly, it wouldn't need leaders. It is precisely because the world is a swelling flood that engagement is a moral imperative. Cynicism is easy. It requires 0 calories.
Yeah.
Hope, the kind of hope that drives you to wade into a flood to pull people out, that is exhausting.
So the reflection for you, the modern listener, is a brutal self-assessment regarding your own sphere of influence. Where have you declared a situation to be a swelling flood simply to absolve yourself of the responsibility to fix it?
That's the real question.
Have you decided your company's culture is beyond repair, so you just collect your paycheck and mock the leadership in private Slack channels? Have you decided local politics are just too toxic, so you don't even bother voting or attending town halls? Cynicism is a highly effective armor, but it guarantees the flood will continue to rise. You must choose whether you are going to be a bitter gourd on the wall, a recluse hiding in the field, or the person who actually wades into the dark fluid.
And if you choose the dark fluid, if you choose to engage with the swelling flood of humanity, you are signing up for inevitable suffering. Because to engage deeply with human beings means you will eventually have to navigate their loss.
Right.
Which introduces a massive mechanical problem for a leader. How do you process profound grief without abandoning the responsibilities of the world you just committed to saving?
That collision between the emotional reality of grief and the mechanical demands of society plays out in this highly controversial debate in Book 17, Chapter 21.
Yes, Saiwu.
A disciple named Sai Wo challenges the fundamental structure of how their society processes death. Specifically, he attacks the 3-year mourning period that is required when a parent dies.
To grasp the friction here, we really must understand the sheer logistical weight of this ritual. A 3-year mourning period wasn't just a suggestion to feel sad for 36 months.
It wasn't just wearing black for a while.
No, it was a complete cessation of societal participation. You wore coarse garments, you ate survival rations, you did not listen to music, and you absolutely did not engage in political or economic advancement. You stepped completely out of the flow of time.
Which Sai Wo points out is a logistical nightmare. He comes to the master and mounts this purely utilitarian argument. He says, look, 3 years is too long. If all the superior men stop governing and performing rituals for 3 years, the entire social order will collapse.
Right.
And then he uses this brilliant mechanistic analogy from nature. He says, within a year, the old grain is exhausted and the new grain has sprung up.
Saiwo is mapping human emotion onto the agricultural cycle.
Exactly.
He is arguing that nature operates on a 12-month reset. The old dies, the earth is bare, the new seed is planted, and the harvest returns. A year is a complete revolution of the Earth's mechanics. Therefore, the human emotional cycle should just mirror the natural cycle. Mourning should be capped at 1 year so we can get back to the business of harvesting the new grain.
I read Sai Wo's argument, and honestly, he sounds exactly like the chief operating officer of a modern corporation.
He really does.
He's arguing for efficiency. And if we look at how the 21st century handles grief, we have entirely adopted Sai Wo's philosophy, but we've compressed his timeline even further.
Oh, way further.
If you lose a parent today, corporate bereavement leave offers you perhaps 3 to 5 days. You get 1 week to process the total collapse of your familial universe, and by the following Monday, you are expected to be on a Zoom call projecting optimized productivity, ready to harvest the new grain.
The modern world pathologizes extended grief because grief is inefficient. It disrupts the machinery of capital and progress. But the master's counterargument to Sai Wu completely bypasses that logistical debate and strikes directly at the psychological core. He doesn't quote a rule book.
No, he asks a question.
Right, a diagnostic question about Sai Wu's internal state. He asks, If you were, after a year, to eat good rice and wear embroidered clothes, would you feel at ease?
And Saiwo, with incredible bluntness, replies, I should.
The master's response is a masterclass in psychological autonomy. He basically says, if you can feel at ease, do it. But a superior man, during the whole period of mourning, does not enjoy pleasant food which he may eat, nor derive pleasure from music which he may hear. He also does not feel at ease if he is comfortably lodged. Therefore, he does not do what you propose. But now you feel at ease and may do it.
The master essentially dismisses him. But the moment Saiwo leaves the room, the master explains the underlying mechanism of the 3-year rule to the other disciples, and it has nothing to do with arbitrary tradition.
No, not at all.
It has to do with biological reciprocity. He says, it is not till a child is 3 years old that it is allowed to leave the arms of its parents, and the 3 years mourning is universally observed throughout the empire. Meaning, Saiwo enjoy the 3 years' love of his parents.
The master is tracing the architecture of human obligation. Think about a human infant. It is entirely helpless. For the first 3 years, the parents must radically disrupt their own lives, sacrificing their own ease, their own sleep, their own pursuit of the new grain to physically sustain the child.
Right.
The 3-year mourning period is not a punishment inflicted by the state. It is the child returning that temporal sacrifice. It is the symmetry of love.
This is where we really need to apply wisdom with discernment for a modern audience. We are not advocating that a modern professional literally put on sackcloth and abandon their career for 36 months.
Definitely not.
The specific cultural wrapper of the 3-year mandate belongs to the agrarian society of ancient China. But the mechanism the master is defending, the absolute necessity of allowing grief to operate on its own psychological timeline, rather than a timeline dictated by economic efficiency, is more urgent now than ever.
Exactly. Saiwo's mistake was attempting to standardize an emotional process. He wanted to optimize grief. But a profound loss shatters the architecture of your life.
Yeah.
The master is granting permission to remain shattered until the foundation can be genuinely rebuilt. He is saying that if you force yourself to put on the embroidered clothes of normalcy while your internal world is still in ruins, you are committing violence against your own humanity.
So the practical reflection here is to examine the artificial timelines you've imposed on your own pain. Where are you rushing a mourning process? And, this applies to the death of a loved one, sure, but also the death of a marriage, the collapse of a business you built, or a devastating betrayal. Where are you rushing that just to get back to eating the good rice?
Right.
Are you pretending to feel at ease because the people around you are uncomfortable with your prolonged sadness? The wisdom here is that the depth of the grief is the exact measure of the depth of the love. You cannot bypass the shadow without disrespecting the light that cast it.
And this brings us to a critical threshold in the text. We have established that a person must engage in relentless learning to calibrate their virtues. They must wade into the dark fluid of a corrupt world to be of use. And they must allow the profound weight of human griefs to hollow them out so they can truly understand human attachment.
Right.
Well, if a person actually manages to synthesize these 3 disciplines, they are finally equipped to wield power over others. Which brings us to the culmination in Book 20, Chapter 2, the actual mechanics of governance and leadership.
Yes. A disciple named Sicheng asks the ultimate structural question. In what way should a person in authority act in order that he may conduct government properly? And, let's translate government here to mean any organizational leadership, a CEO, a department head, a military officer, or a community organizer.
The master provides a highly specific, actionable blueprint. He says a leader must honor the 5 excellent and banish away the 4 bad things.
This is an abstract philosophy. This is an operational manual. Let's start with the diagnostic side, the 4 bad things, because they map so perfectly onto the most common failures in modern management. These are the behaviors that systematically destroy trust within an organization.
Let's do it.
The first bad thing is cruelty. But the master defines it very specifically. To put the people to death without having instructed them. This is called cruelty.
Right.
Now, obviously, we aren't executing employees today.
Yeah.
But let's look at the mechanism of this cruelty. Let's use an analogy. Imagine you hire someone to be a delivery driver, but you only ever train them on how to drive an automatic transmission.
Okay.
On their first major delivery, you hand them the keys to a manual transmission truck. They stall out, they strip the gears, the truck crashes, and the delivery is completely ruined.
Natural.
If you immediately fire them and publicly berate them for incompetence, you haven't exposed the failure of the driver, You have exposed the failure of the instructor. That is cruelty.
That is the exact mechanism. Cruelty in leadership is expecting compliance with uncommunicated standards.
Yes.
It is the manager who assumes an employee should just know the unwritten cultural rules of the office, or who implements a complex new software system with zero training, and then aggressively penalizes the team when productivity inevitably drops. It is a failure of onboarding masquerading as a performance issue.
The second bad thing is oppression, defined as to require from them suddenly the full tale of work without having given them warning.
Oppression operates by removing agency and predictability from the worker. Human beings can endure massive amounts of labor if they can pace themselves and plan their cognitive load.
Right. Yeah.
But when a leader disrupts that pacing with sudden, overwhelming demands, they fracture the worker's sense of control.
This is the infamous Friday at 4:30 p.m. email.
Oh, we all know it.
A director drops a massive, complex analytics project onto a junior analyst's desk, demanding a finished deck by 8 a.m. Monday. The director knew about the project on Tuesday, but just sat on it. By suddenizing the demand, the leader has oppressed the worker, stealing their weekend and spiking their cortisol, simply because the leader lacked the discipline to communicate the timeline earlier.
Which flows directly into the third bad thing. Injury, defined as to issue orders as if without urgency at first, and when the time comes to insist on them with severity.
Moving the goalposts.
Exactly. Injury is the destruction of psychological safety through inconsistent prioritization. A leader tells a team, hey, explore this new market demographic. No rush, it's just a pet project whenever you have downtime.
Right, so the team puts it on the back burner.
Exactly. They allocate their bandwidth accordingly. But 3 days later, the leader bursts into the room, slamming their fist on the table, demanding to know why the demographic report isn't finalized, claiming it's the most critical initiative of the quarter.
It's called injury because it literally damages the team's ability to trust the leader's communication. From that point on, the team will treat every casual request as a life or death emergency, leading to massive burnout, all because the leader's words have lost their calibrated meaning.
And the final bad thing is being a mere official, which the text defines as acting in a stingy way when giving people the pay or rewards they have genuinely earned.
If a team hits their KPIs and they earn the bonus, just give them the bonus with joy.
Right.
Don't make them big for it. Don't try to find technicalities to reduce their commission. When a leader acts like a miser with rewards that are already owed, they signal to the organization that the relationship is purely extractive.
Now, if a leader can successfully banish those 4 destructive mechanisms, they must actively cultivate the 5 excellent things. Let's analyze the mechanics of these positive traits.
Let's do it.
The first is to be beneficent without great expenditure. The text explains this means making more beneficial to the people the things from which they naturally derive benefit.
The key word here is naturally.
Exactly.
Bad leaders think beneficence means forcing expensive top-down initiatives onto the team. Like, we are going to boost morale by flying everyone to a mandatory 3-day corporate retreat in the woods with trust falls.
Everyone's worst nightmare.
It costs a fortune, and everyone hates it. A leader who is beneficent without great expenditure looks at the natural workflow and asks, what do these people actually need? Maybe they just need a better coffee machine. Maybe they need you to eliminate a redundant weekly status meeting that drains 2 hours of their time. You amplify what naturally benefits them rather than enforcing what you think should benefit them.
The second excellent thing is laying tasks on the people without their repining, meaning without them complaining or feeling resentful. The mechanism for this is proper alignment. The text says, when he chooses the labors which are proper and makes them labor on them, who will repine?
This is the core of effective delegation. If you assign a highly creative, big-picture thinker to spend 40 hours doing meticulous data entry, they will repine. They will be miserable. Not because they're lazy, but because the labor is improper to their nature. If you assign a hyper-organized logistics expert to brainstorm abstract marketing concepts, they will repine. Leadership is the puzzle of matching the specific contours of a task to the specific cognitive architecture of the employee. When you achieve that alignment, work actually feels like purpose.
The third is desiring without being covetous. This is the alignment of ambition. A leader must desire growth, success, and excellence for the organization, but the moment that desire shifts into coveting personal glory, hoarding credit, or extracting disproportionate wealth at the expense of the team, The leader just becomes a parasite on the system.
The fourth is maintaining a dignified ease without being proud. This is about egalitarian consistency.
Right.
The text notes that this means a leader, whether he has to do with many people or few or with things great or small, he does not dare to indicate any disrespect. You treat the intern who brings you the mail with the exact same gravity and focused respect as you treat the primary shareholder of the company.
And the final excellent thing is to be majestic without being fierce. This is the ultimate calibration of executive presence.
Let's break down the difference between majesty and fierceness, because they are often conflated in modern toxic leadership.
They really are.
Fierceness relies on volatility. A fierce leader commands a room by making everyone afraid of an unpredictable outburst. They use volume, intimidation, and the threat of professional violence to force compliance.
True. Fierceness is actually a sign of internal weakness. It requires constant external exertion to maintain control. Majesty, however, is gravitational. A majestic leader does not need to raise their voice. Their authority emanates from their competence, their consistency, and their unshakable internal calibration.
Oh, that's good.
People follow a fierce leader because they have to. They follow a majestic leader because they are drawn into the orbit of their stability.
So the practical application for you, the listener, whether you are managing a Fortune 500 company or coordinating a local PTA, is to run a diagnostic check against the four bad things. Where is there friction in your organization? Are your people failing because of cruelty, meaning you haven't actually trained them on your expectations?
Oh.
Are they burning out because of oppression, meaning you are sedentizing demands and destroying their pacing? Diagnose the mechanical failure, and you can begin to apply the 5 excellent remedies.
But this introduces the final, inescapable reality of this text. If you attempt to operate at this level, if you step into the dark fluid, if you try to manage the grief, if you try to execute the 5 excellent things, you will eventually fail.
Yeah.
The cognitive load is just too high, the variables are too complex, you will inevitably commit an act of oppression or injury. The ultimate test of a leader's character is not whether they avoid failure, but the mechanism by which they process their own failure.
Which brings us to the final movement of our deep dive today, Book 19, Chapter 21. If there is one singular image I want burned into the minds of our listeners, it is the astronomy of flaws. The disciple Tse says, "The faults of the superior man are like the eclipses of the sun and moon. He has his faults, and all men see them. He changes again, and all men look up to him."
The mechanical precision of that metaphor is breathtaking. Let's contrast it with the warning given earlier in Book 19, Chapter 8, which states, "The mean man is sure to gloss his faults."
To gloss, to cover up, to apply a thin layer of paint over a rotting piece of wood so it looks pristine on the surface.
Yes. The mean man, the inferior leader, operates under the delusion that authority requires the illusion of perfection. When they make a mistake, their immediate instinct is containment. They hire PR firms to spin the narrative, they shift the blame to subordinates, or they simply deny the reality of the error. They gloss the fault.
But the eclipse metaphor obliterates the idea of glossing. When a solar eclipse happens, you cannot hide it. It is an astronomical event that literally darkens the sky. Every single person on the planet looks up and sees it. Tse is saying that when a true leader fails, that failure is public. It is undeniable.
But the critical distinction is what happens after the darkness. An eclipse is a temporary transit. The shadow passes. The text says, "He changes again, and all men look up to him." The superior leader does not deny the eclipse. They acknowledge the darkness, and then they publicly, transparently do the work of realigning themselves until the light returns.
Think about this in the context of modern software development. When a major tech company releases a piece of software that contains a massive critical bug that crashes everyone's system, they don't pretend the bug didn't happen. That would be glossing the fault. Everyone already knows the system crashed.
Right, the sky is already dark.
Exactly. What do? They openly acknowledge the error, they write the new code, and they publish the patch notes. They say, here is exactly how our code failed, and here is exactly the mechanism we built to fix it.
The transparent course correction is what restores trust.
Yes. The text is arguing that moral authority works the exact same way. When you lose your temper and commit an act of injury against your team, don't gloss it. Stand in front of the team and say, I failed to calibrate my stress. I suddenly demanded work without warning, and I violated the trust of this room. Here is how I am changing my workflow to ensure it doesn't happen again. When the team watches you execute that change, when they watch the sun emerge from behind the shadow, their respect for you will actually eclipse the respect they had before the failure.
It is the ultimate integration of the entire philosophy we've discussed today. To publicly admit a fault requires the suppression of pride and the elevation of the love of learning. To actively change requires the daily practice that separates us from our baseline nature.
I want to leave you with a final thought that locks these ancient concepts into a single framework for your own life. Think about the collision between the bitter gourd and the eclipse. If you choose the path of the bitter gourd, if you choose to hang on the wall, remaining aloof, cynical, and isolated from the messy realities of leadership and human engagement, you will never experience an eclipse. You will remain perfectly painted, perfectly pristine, and perfectly useless.
Right.
But if you choose to get off the wall, if you choose to plunge yourself into the dark fluid of a complex, struggling world to try and build something better, you will cast a shadow. You will make mistakes. But if your commitment to learning is relentless, those mistakes will not be permanent darkness. They will be eclipses, temporary, transparent moments of realignment that ultimately prove the integrity of your light. So do not fear the eclipse. Get off the wall and engage the flood.
That's incredibly powerful.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.